advertise them. And he asked me, is that the Horonui or Waiau River down there? And I said, I'm not sure. I was struggling with my somewhere. I said, breakfast.
Halfway. Oh, it's fine. I wouldn't have had time anyway. It's just one of these things that happens, isn't it?
I suppose it's appropriate to make a little bit of an announcement. I understand there's going to be a announcement at 1 o'clock this afternoon from Wellington, just in regards to COVID in the community down there. So just a reminder that if people haven't, please make sure that they've used the Tracer app, and you've got that recorded just in case any of us folk have been in Wellington in the last wee while, and I'm sure there's a few of us who've either been through Wellington, working in Wellington, or live in Wellington. So just a little bit of a reminder for everyone. And
there's nothing wrong with people from Wellington.
yeah, it may mean that I'm not going to be in Wellington tomorrow, which suits me just fine. Yes, so any excuse to stay here in Hawke's Bay would be appreciated. Okay. So we're back in your hands, and I think Mr. Russell Bond is our next.
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to just follow on from Mr. Chapman and I guess acknowledge a few of your questions. My personal qualifications, I have a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Technology from Waikato, and that was majoring in industrial chemistry, microbiology and environmental technologies. Also had national reticulation training from OPIS training, and also was on working parties that helped develop the 2005 and 2008 drinking water standards. And I've been a member of the Water Services Managers Group, which is the national water industry for 20 years.
Thank you.
Just on the topic of leakage, sorry. I just think, yeah.
Just a break.
Yeah.
You want a break?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know why I just got shakes. I just had a coffee.
Oh. Okay, yes, sorry.
Do you want us to go on?
Are you feeling okay? Do you want
I
to
might
just
just
take
go
a little
for a
bit of
walk.
break?
Just
Yeah, we might
Sorry.
move on to another
That's
witness,
perfectly
if
fine.
that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'll call Ms. Sweeney and we'll come back to
Let us know when you
Mr.
feel
Bond.
comfortable to present.
Just reacting to the coffee, sorry.
You're good.
Yeah, thank you. So I just a question, do you want me to read my summary or just...
Yes, please.
Okay. So just start there, I said before, Annette Sweeney, I'm a principal of Good Earth Matters Consulting.
Oh, we probably don't need to go through those preliminary
Good,
parts.
yep. I guess there's 3 points or 3 areas that my evidence and the summary covers.
Yes.
The first is around the allocation of water for municipal water supplies, and that relates to the Council's submission seeking that policies and rules reference HPUD's 2017 or successive versions or any requirements prescribed under the MPS on urban development. And as has been traversed already this morning, that the most recent growth projections indicate that the growth is likely to significantly exceed that stated in HPUD's 2017. The other area, I guess, that needs to be noted is that due to water services reform, it's likely that councils will need to consider expanding their serviced areas such that more properties may need to be supplied without any additional growth. And Mr Chapman spoke about that this morning in terms of the Hastings urban supply has already been expanded to service Bridgepower and Pakipak. So there's kind of, I guess, two areas where the municipal water supply may need to, or will need to, service more people than it is doing now. One is through growth and the other is through expansion of that networked area. So the relief sought was that the policies and rules reference those newer growth projections, and also that there be a pathway for consenting of municipal water supplies that doesn't lead to a prohibited activity rule. Now, in terms of that pathway, what the councils are seeking is that there is ability to obtain some more allocation of water if needed to provide for those growth projections, but only in the case where efficiency standards are met. So definitely not an intention to avoid the need to have efficiency and achieve best practice standards, but noting that there's a practical limitation to how much savings that can achieve, and at some point the growth will continue beyond that, so further allocation may be needed. And in my view, the diagram provided by the Regional Council officers in terms of Rules 10.11 and 10.12 was helpful, but I consider that there is potential that an application where a council is seeking additional water to meet growth demands may be interpreted as being prohibited under 10.12, and that relates to how the activity is described and whether it meets the intent, the wording of a continuation of existing activity under 10.11. So the evidence I presented is that there is an addendum to Rule 10.11 which could be made, which would make it clear that that instance it would be a discretionary activity and not lead down a prohibited activity pathway. So the relief sought is really to provide clarity that that would be the case. And then obviously for reasons set out in my evidence, if that pathway is to be provided, then in my view the policy provisions should provide for reference to the successive versions of HPUDs and not be restricted to the HPUDs 2017. The other area where there's a need for the rules to provide for that growth is in relation to transfers, and that relates to RRMP Rule 62A. And in my opinion, there remains some ambiguity about the wording of that rule, and the relief which the council is seeking is that some clarity be provided so that RRMP Rule 62 enables transfers from one municipal supply to another, so between the Napier and Hastings systems, but also where the network is expanded into essentially self-service areas, that there be some ability to transfer that allocation to the municipal supply so that it's got ability to deliver to those expanded areas. And I guess just referencing Bridgepower and Pakipaki, those are areas where the Hastings network was expanded, so provided for those additional communities, and that was done without seeking any additional allocation at the time. But those that action really is pulling out some of the headroom that the community has to grow within its existing consented allocation. So it's about enabling that growth and that expansion of the network where it's appropriate, and having that allocation provided. I haven't picked it up in my evidence or my summary, but I note that RRMP Rule 62A, that being a controlled activity, the relief that's seeking there may need to be some consequential changes to tank policy 28 as well to have some consistency of wording. So it's just a point to raise there. In terms of source protection provisions, the relief sought was essentially to achieve some consistency across the plan, so there were some minor amendments around the matters of control and discretion, and to reflect the recommendations of the joint working group. and those amendments have largely been accepted in the Section 42A addendum report, except there's a couple that I've just noted in my summary starting at paragraph 9. One is in relation to objective tank 9. So amendments have been made to that objective in response to the evidence by others, and to essentially write that objective as an outcome statement. I support that approach, but I note that the wording related to managing risk to the source water has been removed. In my opinion, managing risk to the source water is a key part of the source protection framework, and the objective should reference both the suitability for human consumption, which it does, and that risks are appropriately managed. So we would like to see that wording reinstated. The other area relates to policy tank 7, and that's covered in my evidence at paragraphs 54 to 56. So as written, that policy establishes a mechanism by which the source protection zones can be updated via a consent process. I consider that's no longer appropriate given that the current proposal is for the source protection maps to be maps within the regional plan in order to have regulatory status, and therefore updating those through a resource consent process would be inappropriate. It would need to go through a plan change process. So in my view, policy tank 7 remains relevant, but it needs to be redrafted to refer to source protection extents rather than source protection zones. The last point in terms of the source protection zones maps relates to the evidence that Mr Chapman has led, and the District Council's seeking the larger source protection map for Hastings Supply. And note that Regional Council officers have stated that they consider that the source protection zone sought by the District Council is overly conservative. Obviously the spatial definition, the map, the modelling of that is outside of my expertise, but I note that from a planning perspective I consider that a precautionary approach would be appropriate in terms of managing source water, and it would not be inconsistent with Objectives Tank 4 and Policy Tank 6. In terms of regulatory burden, because I think that's an issue which is often stated in terms of these issues, that essentially we're drawing a line on a map, which means that there's obligations on landowners and occupiers in that area that they may need to seek consent for activities which they otherwise wouldn't need consent for. So what I do know is that where the SPZ is increased over the unconfined aquifer, it doesn't increase any regulatory burden, so the consenting needs are the same, because the source protection zone provisions have essentially been developed such that it gives the source protection zone the same protection as the unconfined aquifer. So the activities which need consent over the unconfined aquifer are the same as what needs consent under source protection. What the source protection provisions do is they make it explicit what's required in terms of the assessment for source protection, so it provides some clarity into that consent process. I do acknowledge, however, that where the source protection zone may be extended over the confined aquifer, there are some changes in activity status, and I've set that out in the table in paragraph 12 of my summary. So there's three activities which are moving from permitted, in other words not needing consent, through to restricted discretionary. So I note that that is a cost on the property owners in that space. However, do note that just because an activity is permitted doesn't necessarily mean that it's a zero cost activity, and I point to, for example, new sewage systems. To be permitted requires compliance with approximately about 21 criteria, including that there's advanced primary treatment and maintenance in accordance with manufacturers' recommendations. So there is an expectation that there's an ongoing need to maintain service and support that permitted activity.
So by sewage systems there you mean domestic
On-site wastewater, yes.
On-site wastewater.
Yeah, so that's the I guess the outstanding matters in terms of source protection. There is one other matter which I haven't picked up in my summary that was in the council's submissions and my evidence and not responded to in the section 42 addendum, and that is relation to the farm plans and industry collective, catchment collective provisions. The councils were seeking that some advice note be included into the requirements for farm plans, which is really trying to send a signal to the drafters of those plans to engage with the water suppliers to be able to understand potential risks of their activities. So the councils are trying to seek a framework where people within the source protection zones will engage with the water supplier so that there's understanding about the activities which are occurring, and there can be a discussion as to what the best form of risk management is. The advice note is simply intended to direct people that it's not up to themselves individually to do that risk assessment and understand the water supplier, that the water suppliers are willing to be engaged with the landowners and work collaboratively in that process. In terms of stormwater provisions, the minor corrections which were sought by the councils have largely been accepted in the Section 42A addendum report. There are four areas that just want to draw attention to. One relates to policies 28J and 31C, which appear to be directing amendments to the district plans, which, while the councils are supportive of a collaborative approach and alignment, we are just questioning whether that's an appropriate direction to be given through a regional plan policy. In terms of Rule Tank 19, that provides for stormwater from individual properties to be considered as permitted activities. And the intention, I understand, of that rule was that it wasn't intended to provide for stormwater from individual properties to be permitted activities where they could connect to a stormwater network. And I raised in my evidence some concern around the condition in that rule, and I note that the Section 42A officers had some difficulty with the relief that I suggested, which I don't necessarily disagree with. Regional council officers have recommended deletion of that particular criteria and have indicated that rules 19 and 20 do not enable people to, or developers to, have permitted activity or discharges to land where there's a stormwater network available. My view of that is I do not necessarily see that that intent has been achieved through rules 19 and 20. Particularly that Rule 19 allows for permitted activity as discharge of stormwater to land for anything with less than 1,000 square metres of area impervious land. So there's potentially some cumulative effects which may occur in development if that occurs. You'll see from the exchange of evidence and the Section 42A reports that both myself and the regional council officers have probably struggled to word an appropriate phrase, and I'm suggesting that maybe that may be a matter for caucusing if we can, if there's agreement in terms of the intent. In terms of Rule 21, that's the rule which provides for municipal stormwater systems as a controlled activity. There has been some amendment to clause AII in relation to my evidence. I'm suggesting here that we also need to provide for primary flow paths as well as secondary flow paths within that amendment, and that would cover the situation of open water courses which are used for conveyance of stormwater as both primary and secondary flow paths, and that's simply to ensure that the stormwater networks can be considered under the controlled activity status. My last point in paragraph D there is also to ensure that the municipal stormwater networks can be considered as a controlled activity. At the moment, how it's written is that to be a controlled activity, the discharge cannot have any sewage, black water or grey water. Now, I agree with the intent that the stormwater system should not convey those elements. However, any presence of E. coli may mean that it gets essentially ruled out of being considered as a controlled activity. So I'm just suggesting that an alternative phrasing may be that the discharge, the diversion of the discharge shall not contain any discharges from a stormwater network or part thereof that includes a direct connection from a sewerage, blackwater or grey water system to the stormwater network. And in terms of that, I note that the assessment criteria and the integrated catchment management plan criteria require consideration around overflows of sewage systems into stormwater. So this is not intended to avoid the need to address overflows and remove those from the system. It's just simply to make sure that the initial interpretation of that criteria is such that those plans, those networks can be considered as a controlled activity. So happy to answer any questions.
Just in terms of primary and secondary flow paths,
Yeah.
are they defined anywhere in particular?
I don't know if they are specifically defined. I would expect them to be identified through the integrated catchment management plan. Normally the primary flow path is the piped and the open watercourse network, and secondary is often the roading network plus any specific secondary flow paths.
Just wondering if that wording is clear enough to avoid any confusion or
Oh, okay.
misinterpretation
Sorry, so you're meaning, yeah.
within the plan, that is.
Yeah, the primary and secondary flow paths and who's what they mean would be defined in the stormwater bylaw and normally in the code of practice or engineering standards for the particular council, and that's typically referred to through the district plan.
Yeah, I might come back with another question in your last paragraph. I'll digest it again.
In your paragraph 3, how would efficiency be measured?
Yeah, that's a good question. My reference there is in relation to, I think, policy tank 50, where it talks about efficiency, best practice, and including the ILI of 4 or better. And I think Mr. Chapman's alluded to the fact that there is no national definition of efficiency in terms of these networks.
I know I found it wasn't anywhere. So what would you understand by efficiency? Because if you put something like that in,
Yeah.
and it can't be measured or it can't be defined, it's a fairly meaningless word in a policy, objective policy or rule.
Yeah. I agree with you, there's difficulty in that. It's not unusual for plan provisions to refer to best practice in terms of industry. The question is what that means. My expectation is that that's coming through the water services reform. I know it's something which Taumata Arawai is looking at, but you're right that at the moment the best measure that we would have is the infrastructure leakage index.
Which is a comparative instrument primarily.
It's a standardised methodology in terms of assessing the non-revenue water. And I'm stepping a little bit outside of my area, so Mr. Chapman may want to add to this. And then the bands which they're put into, and that is a comparative basis.
It would just concern me that if a measure was put, something like that was put in the plan and didn't have some quantifiable basis, or at least some measurable basis, then it just becomes a word that gets argued about in future consent conditions and those sort of things. So if any of you have any suggestions about how that might be measured, we'd be interested in hearing them, or I'd certainly be interested in hearing them in due course, because I'm always very leery having come across that word in plans when I'm doing consent decisions, it's really difficult to assess if you don't have some at least measure, semi-quantifiable performance standard.
Yeah, that's fair.
Would you like me to comment? I think as a water supplier, there are a range of tools in the toolbox that you can apply to both demand management and managing infrastructure to reduce leakage and the like. I think what's important here is if a water supplier has a strategy, so they've identified where low-hanging fruit are, where other tools might be employed, and I talked about water metering, to then achieve more in, let's talk about being efficient, it's still ultimately going to have a measure in place, i.e. 15% or 10%, and a standard for being able to measure and report on that. So it's where you can get best value for your investment in terms of reducing leakage and then being able to demonstrate that. So I don't think there's a simple equation or something simple that says when you reach this target you're being efficient. If I use it in an industry sense, an industry could be very efficient in terms of inputs and outputs, but be very inefficient about how they're using that water. So yeah, I don't think you'll be able to define it in one particular sense. It's about having a strategy in place. Everyone's agreed that if you are implementing the strategy and doing the things roughly in the time frames with the investment that you're proposing, then you are moving on that continuum of being more efficient, adopting best practice and doing the things that a prudent water supplier would do.
Thank you. If you can think of a measure, I'd be interested in knowing.
Just a clarification. This is at paragraph 14A, and just which says policies 28J and 31C. And just in more evidence says policy 28G and policy 31C. I'm just clarifying. Is it 28G or J?
J in, yeah, policy 28J.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, in just regards to these matters, paragraph 14, A, B, C, and D, these are quite specific in matters of detail, and I'm just wondering whether it might be worthwhile a conversation between yourself and the council officers, perhaps during the lunch break, to see if you can come into any agreement in terms of specific wording or not.
Or sometime.
Okay. So we have a conversation.
Yes.
Kim Anstey, who has prepared the stormwater section for us, had surgery just the other day. So she's aiming to come in, but we're actually suggesting she shouldn't because she should be recovering rather than attending. So we're still having that debate with her.
So we because there's a conversation between you and the right council officer in due course.
Yeah, if those matters could be resolved, or any remaining disagreements highlighted, that would be really good.
Just on your 14D, well, I'll put it on the general topic. You've got there your suggested rewording, second to last line about a direct connection from a sewage, blackwater or grey water system. So I'm just trying to work out how direct is a direct connection, because I do have some familiarity with cross connection issues and old sewer / stormwater systems that are designed to trip under high flow.
Yes, it's a fair question, and I think you're right there. What I was intending, because I would hope that there's no direct connections as such. What I was
I think we all
tending
know
to
what you
cover
mean,
was
it's just
exactly
what it
that
says.
in terms of the cross connections, the previous combined systems, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, that might be something you wish to
Yeah.
discuss with the council staff when you get around to doing that. Thank you.
We didn't have any further questions. Thank you very much. How are you feeling, Mr. Bond?
Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
apologies for that.
No need to apologise.
Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to support Mr. Chapman's comments around the source protection zones. We believe that in light of some of the constraints that we find as suppliers and the responsibilities to protect public health, I believe that the larger of the two calculations through that planning process will help us and enable us to be involved in the process earlier, rather than at a later stage through a building consent or resource consent process that some of our other council officers would then do. So it just helps us understand the risks to water supply in our source water and what might be required of those industries, and it's sort of really protecting the future problems that we might find that we may have to deal with. So, and I guess the Havelock event was, you know, a representation of that, where the design of our bore heads have changed as a result of that to enable better protection of our wellheads, and I know Napier City has learned a lesson from our neighbours as well. And we've gone around and improved our supplies. So, in terms of the water demand and leakage, I've had a bit of experience in other councils around the country. There's a few examples. I know we did leak detection in Clyde. We ended up doing night acoustic detection, and I think there was a question around private versus public leakage, and we found that we had 15% leakage on the whole system as a whole, but 25% of that 15% was actual council mains, and the 75% we found was private plumbing. So there's quite a lot of leakage in the residential plumbing and household fittings. So it was quite a big statistic. We were very surprised about that. We thought it might have been the other way around.
So could you just repeat that statistic to me again? I just want to make sure I heard it in the right way around.
So there was, out of the whole system, there's 15% leakage.
Yes.
And out of the 15%, the split between residential and public network was 75% on the private property side. Yep.
So 75% on the...
Would pass the point of supply.
Yep.
So,
That's
yeah.
right. That's right.
So that's effectively the connection between the network on the street and
Yep.
the private,
Yeah,
the private household.
correct. The Toby to effectively the house. Yeah.
And that was what, Clyde, did you say?
Clyde, yes.
Yep.
Yep.
I want to make sure we weren't referring to Napier City or...
No, sorry. Yeah. Napier City, we're going through leak detection works as well. We've and in the evidence, I've put a recent table based around the Ahuriri and the West Shore leak detection work we've done just recently, and that's indicated that we have a higher leakage rate to what we've previously calculated. I guess that goes back to Mr. Chapman's comments around, you know, just the discrepancies in how we calculate and estimate the leakage, and when we go out and we find, we go and investigate further and we get more actual data that can feed in, we can, you know, we improve our understanding, and we can target our response to that. And part of the program that Napier City has agreed to in the long-term plan is looking at creating DMAs, or district monitored areas. So it's looking at creating mini networks or zones within the supply, and we've recently created one in the Tamatea and Parklands area, and what it does is it allows us to feed a particular area from one point in the network, and on that point we can monitor both the flow, the demand and the water quality going into those zones. So what it does is it allows us to target and review flows going in on an annual basis, and then we can target and see those areas that have high leakage, so we can, I guess, target our workforce and resources into those areas rather than trying to do the whole city at large, and just not getting that efficiency or economy with the budgets that we have available. So we've still got, just on the back end of the Ahuriri and West Shore Leak Protection Program, we've got another 2 years where we're doing the other 2/3 of the city as well. So we are still doing a citywide approach over a 3-year period. But we are looking at that, trying to make an efficient, a more targeted leak detection program, like I said, with TMAs. There was a comment around metering. We currently meter our industrial users, and also we meter our Bayview residents. That's, I believe, it was when Bayview came into the Napier scheme. I think that was part of the borough days, and just the transition from when the borough was connecting into council. That was to enable, I think, a loan repayment for the pipeline and the connection. And that.
Has there been any data that would provide any understanding of the household use in Bayview vis-a-vis the other areas?
I don't believe I've put that in. No, I don't think. I can provide that if you wish.
It's more just a point of interest, just to see whether metering in one area suggests significantly or some significantly less use of water.
Yeah. I've generally found, having gone through the metering process in Centro Otago, that the metering, it's actually how people value the water and that they use is actually through the billing process. So the water meter and the education, we found, didn't reduce a lot of water use through the community. It was only until we actually sent out that first bill.
The financial incentive.
Yeah. Yes. So, and it's the pricing structure that will then potentially get those changes. So the current structure with the Bayview residents is there's a 300 cubic metre, I guess, volume of water that comes with the connection. So that's an annual. Anything over that 300 is billed at a volumetric rate. So.
Is that for a household? Sorry, that 300 cubic?
Yep. Yeah. Commercial is strictly volumetric. So we've also got our water bylaw is due for review. So that pricing mechanism is up for review as well, because there's comments in the community about the just the fairness of it, given that the Napier residents I guess don't have that what Bayview sees as a restriction to their water supply. So, yeah. So I know council's looking at that in the next 12 to 18 months.
And it's always a political hot potato.
Yep. Yeah, because we've recently, just on the bylaws, we've recently done the stormwater bylaw review as well. So that was done last year, and we're currently in the process of going through our trade waste bylaw review. So looking at, I guess, the impact of our industrial commercial users on our networks. There was a comment around the processed water for industrial. There's a lot of our industrial users have their own bores that use processed water. But we do have currently 22 industries that, to some degree or other, use our water for process. I don't know the volume of that. I can, but given we've had 26,000 connections, it's quite a low percentage of our network.
This was a matter that came up where we had, I think, particularly, well, I can't remember exactly this, it might have been Heinz Waddy's associated industries, and we're just trying to get a figure on, some were using municipal supplies, some had their own bores, and just trying to get a feel in terms of a percentage, how many of those more industrial type activities actually had access to municipal supply, so they didn't necessarily have to fit the actual reasonable.
Yeah.
So it was just having an understanding of what that might be at a broad scale.
The other water demand, how we manage water demand through summer communication campaigns. We have a sort of we work with our neighbours and regional council as well in terms of educating our communities for efficient water use and demand. We're in the process of reviewing our conservation management plan and water demand management plan. This is in light of our resource consents for our water takers due for renewal in a couple of years, so I think 2027 I believe. So, but that's also in line with the work that we're trying to do with the master plan and the new source bore fields. So.
Does Napier have restriction, summer restrictions?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the recent summer event we went to a level 3, which was all, it pretty much banned sprinkler use and it went to handheld only, so yeah. The other comments I noted here, I know there's the perception of rural, urban. It's not uncommon to the Hawke's Bay. It's something. It's a conversation I've had in other districts. I guess the urban areas, we do have a lot of support services for the rural economy, in terms of the likes of the tanneries and the meatworks and the likes, even the port and the freight. So we do recognise those industries in terms of and the part they play in the rural economy. So it's it's just that it's a common conversation, I guess, in terms of. And what we try to do is we make sure that we're playing our part as part of that wider with good efficient water use, and also ensuring that we're achieving the resource consents for our wastewater discharges where the same policies are required of our rural industries. I guess just to touch on just some of the, I think the question was the Tamana Arawai, was that, did I pronounce that correctly, sorry? The Tamana Arawai?
Taumata Arawai, water regulator.
Oh, sorry, no, the holistic.
Or Tamana o Te Wai.
Thank you very much, sorry.
Yeah.
So, council is, we have a very, I guess, a holistic approach to the water. We're very much aware that historically we've been quite hydraulic in our solutions, so it's very, very much trying to get water into the city and then get water out of the city in terms of stormwater and flood control. We've identified that's become apparent through our master planning process. We've identified the shortcomings in that, and We've got it in our LTP. We're looking at a water quality management plan, particularly in our stormwater. We've also identified the need for more cultural engagement and input into our design and management of our water. And so we have projects and budgets available, and that we are looking to help strengthen our management and policies around that. Some obviously that's come about through the stormwater bylaw work that we've done last year, and we've got a lot of projects around estuary protection for the Ahuriri, and also our waterways. So we're looking at ways of how do we improve the community's value in the waterways, trying to get them past seeing it as a flood channel or a drain. We're trying to improve that, I guess, the ownership and the interaction in those areas. So we're looking at improving our waterways. We have our industrial area. We have encroachment issues where some of the industries their fence is pushed right back onto the water, the embankment, and so we're pushing them back off our land, the reserve, and we're looking at putting pathways so we can get more people down that areas and to help clean up that water as well. I know we've got a series of combined water quality studies with the Regional Council. We've done a lot of water sampling throughout our waterways to try and understand the condition of our water in terms of water quality. We've also looking at, we've soil sampling through particularly around the Pandora area, the Thames Tyne industrial area, to see I guess the historic impact of that industrial area around there, and how we might rehabilitate, or what sort of treatment's required to actually bring those ecosystems back, back to good health. So we do have the Ahuriri Estuary Master Plan document, which is guiding a lot of that work, which has identified our development of Lagoon Farm, creating a regional park in that area up by the Park Island area. So that has been identified in our stormwater modelling and master plan as quite a key facility in terms of not only hydraulic improving flood management, but also a potential to improve the water quality before it enters into the estuary. We've also looking at ways of improving the comment around the stormwater being with wastewater getting into the stormwater network and to the waterways. So we're looking at we're in the design phase of a large emergency storage pond at our wastewater treatment plant. So we're looking at, because our current restriction is through our consent, our ability to discharge during a wet weather event. So at this point we tend to use the network as storage, so we slow the pumps down and just and discharge at what the plant can deliver through the consent process. So we're looking to, but what that does is we use up the storage and then it gets to capacity, and then obviously it discharges through manholes and into the estuary area, so which is undesirable. So we're looking at having quite a significant amount of storage and develop that at the plant. So we're hoping to get that underway this construction season.
I think we might just pause there, just see if we've got any questions, and then perhaps pass it back to you if you've got any concluding comments or things you just wanted to raise.
I've got just two matters. Would Napier Hill, which is very lumpy, is it likely that stormwater leakage would be greater in hill suburbs than in flat areas?
Sorry, the stormwater.
Yeah, no, I mean, water supply. Is it likely there would be more leakage from your water supply network, the municipal network in hill suburbs rather than flat suburbs?
It's quite subjective. Leakage, yeah. Leakage is directly proportional to pressure, so you can have more flow if you've got more pressure. So I guess the way that Napier is structured, that we get a greater volume from the same size leak as we would on a hill. But it's also, I guess, as Mr. Chapman mentioned before, around the types of fittings that we would have used throughout
The age of that network.
the age of the network. Also, yeah, construction technology, techniques and how it was laid. And also it depends. Also, what sort of soil type or geography you have your network sitting in as well, and can impact some of those fittings and pipes. So you have a different deterioration rate of going through peat, clay, or gravels.
Yep.
So, yeah.
And second question, and I'm going to call her Anna because I struggle with her surname. And I was talking to Anna who said the council's very happy with Napier's approach to stormwater discharges to Ahuriri Estuary, and a lot of work's being done. I notice in your original submission there's very little comment on the stormwater, the proposed stormwater condition, proposed stormwater objective policy rule, flow, if you like. So you're pretty happy with what's in the plan at the moment?
So in terms of the stormwater,
In terms of stormwater?
I believe so. Yeah, yeah. So because we've gone through, we have a environmental solutions team who deal mainly in the stormwater and liaise heavily with the regional council.
Yep.
So
And I think Ms Sweeney's raised a few matters in relation to stormwater, but they're relatively minor, if you like, around those. So it's just some matters of detail that are of concern.
correct. Yeah, I believe so. I definitely believe the objectives are aligned with Napier's objectives and what they're trying to achieve within the city. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I just had a question.
Oh, sorry. No, just seeing if there are questions.
Yesterday we had the Ahuriri Estuary Protection Society, I think they were called, presentation, and they talked about some of the issues in the estuary, and I asked probably an unfair question about, do they know about the level of cross connections or sewage overflows into the stormwater system that feeds into that estuary? So I'm sort of putting that question to you. You've already sort of addressed it earlier on, but how much of an issue is it for the estuary? Is it something that only happens when you've got significant flooding, or is it something that's more regular? And how regular is sewage discharges into the estuary?
Yeah. It's definitely in high weather events. Recently, over the weekend, but having said that we didn't have a discharge during the rain events just recently. But it's potentially a sustained, if it's a wet duration, typically more than 3 days, we might start to get a bit of pressure. But it's really about the intensity and the volume. Obviously, we have areas where they. Where, like I mentioned before about the treatment plant, if we can't remove water as quick as we can, we need to store it in some way. And that's when we lose that volume in terms of in the network, and that's when it can be discharged. So there are during the November floods, we had there are 2 spots where there are controlled discharge to our stormwater network. and it's at this point in time, there's no, they're a manual valve, so we're looking at, we've got a bit of work this year to put a flow meter on those and automate so that we know the volume of water that may be required to discharge through that. It's obviously not something we like doing. And I guess it's just the flat nature of where Napier's situated and its network. So.
Are they do those particular stormwater discharges have consents?
No.
They're not.
No, they're not. No.
So therefore, if there is a sewage spill into them, that's not currently consented either. I know, for instance, Dunedin has some consents that allow for that, but they're short-term consents. But
okay. I know regional councils are very reluctant, and I understand why, to consent those sorts of discharges. It's we've identified those, and our communities are one of the comments through the LTP process. They don't want to see any sewage discharges to the estuary, which we understand. So our LTP program is based around looking to address that. So we have programs in there to remove those.
So just on that, in terms of the time frames for that,
yeah,
can you give me a steer on that? So at the moment you talked about you've got capacity in the reticulated network that absorbs some of the overflow, and then you're building some storage
at the plant.
And I don't know what your time frame is for that completion of that, and then is there anything beyond that as well that you are looking to address?
Oh, most definitely, yeah. Excuse me. The storage at the plant, we're looking for a 24 hours of volume. We currently we're looking at a 3-cell system. We're currently looking to deliver one of those cells this year. We need to that will add to our, we've currently got 1 cell there, which is quite small, which we need to upsize. But so we'll deliver the 3rd cell as well as upgrade the 1st cell in hopefully within 5 years as part of our, we've got to replace our outfall pipe into the ocean. So we're going through a resource consent process in the next couple of years. So we need to do that as part of the physical works to actually enable us to replace that outfall to provide that offline storage while we do the physical works on the connection. So that's we need that in place to help facilitate that. So that's a 5-year time frame. In terms of the other work and around our 10-year program is quite. We've got in the water, 3 waters alone, we're looking at a budget of $400 million in the capital program. And we're trying to address, obviously, with the recent flood, there's some significant flood concerns within the community. So we're trying to improve some trunk mains in terms of draining those areas that were significantly affected in Maraenui, CBD area. So we've got some significant projects in trying to help improve the flood control, and that will help alleviate that. That will help with that pressure on the wastewater system as well. So we'll try and reduce that stormwater entering the system.
Right, thank you for that.
I just had a question that's probably for yourself, and Hawke's Bay at the same time. I'm just trying to see where the levels of service fit into are they levels of service in the LTP, or they're sitting in a document that's separate, or they're a little bit of an orphan sitting somewhere else?
No, the levels of service typically would be in the LTP. They also sit in the asset management plans, which do inform the LTP. There's also a document, infrastructure strategy documents that councils produce as part of the LTP process, which has a more an overarching sort of strategy of and it brings in other sort of constraints or drivers for to improve the infrastructure. So yeah.
Invite Hastings.
So the same applies in Hastings in terms of those documents. What there also is the mandatory reporting requirements for the DIA. So they're in regard to response times, meeting the drinking water standards, infringements and abatement notices that you might receive in terms of discharges and the like. So that's perhaps clarified for a lot of suppliers the level of service requirements that they have to meet for DIA, but also included within the documents that Mr. Bonds mentioned are perhaps operational levels of service, which might be around minimum pressures, flows, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I don't think we've got any other questions.
Thank you. We have one remaining witness, Mr. Drury.
Thank you. Actually, we might just, it's gone awfully quiet in here, so we're just going to stretch our legs just for a minute. And it might be because it's getting really warm. We're feeling the heat behind us.
Yep. Okay, so
I'm happy for you to interpolate as you go.
yeah, all good. I'll start at paragraph 6. Or actually, I'll just go over. Effectively, my evidence covers off 6 points. Arguably, the first 2 potentially the more contentious, and then the following 4 just some simple points to be made. So moving to paragraph 6. So the point there is that, in my view, the 90 million cubic metres per year is best referred to as a target as opposed to a limit. I provide some evidence there that essentially HBRC's own statement is that it's the best estimation, and I just do not consider that to be a solid basis on which to decide a limit, meaning the term target is more appropriate, with the comment there that a limit should be the product of the process in policy 42, once a lot more information is obtained. The councils are also concerned that neither the definition of actual and reasonable nor policy 37 itself contemplates a situation where an activity has been making use of the full allocation of its permit, has not been making full use of its allocation for valid reasons. So with policy tank 37 preventing regard being had to the value of investment, in my view it is contrary to section 1042A of the RMA, and from an implementation perspective actually places officers in a position of needing to reconcile a policy and a statutory obligation which actually pull in different directions. So I provided amendments to policy 37 to look to address this essentially, and that was a 2-step process. The amendments did not change the starting point, i.e. consider actual and reasonable as defined, but what they do is enable the decision maker to meet its obligations under section 1042A in a guided fashion and provide a small window of opportunity for consideration in line with the outcomes sought in the RPS of applications where, for whatever reason, the previous allocation has not been fully utilised. So essentially it's creating the opportunity to have a think about things in a guided manner. Moving down to the second point, so this is all about providing for future opportunities of a very limited nature. So Plan Change 9 should retain the opportunity for new consents to be granted where there would be significant social, economic and or environmental benefit. A new policy, referred to as Policy 37A, and a change from prohibited to a non-compliant activity status was proposed. So the new policy strictly confines the class of activities that may be eligible for consent to those that reflect outcomes and priorities identified in the RPS. So in developing that policy, we have taken a lot of guidance from what the RPS is actually telling us. A policy that at least enables the consideration of outcomes identified and prioritised in the RPS is clearly more consistent with the RPS than intentionally prohibiting such consideration as Plan Change 9 currently proposes. The opportunity to at least consider proposals also avoids unintended consequences, and I provided a few examples of such unintended consequences in my evidence. I was cautious not to try to crystal ball gaze everything in the future, but it was really just to present the basis of some of that concern. My evidence in chief then turns to the consideration of the pros and cons of the prohibited versus non-compliant activity status, and I referred back to the Section 32A report itself, where there is a lot of consideration given to this. Here the author stated on page 286 that it was very finely balanced. But my review of the Section 32A report was that the analysis didn't consider the ability to mitigate some of the cons through including specific policy guidance. And I think that's a key factor. Because in my view, with such a policy that we're suggesting, or policy guidance in general, the justification for a prohibited status does fall away. In my evidence, I make the final observation that as a minimum, applications for municipal water supply purposes should not fall to being prohibited under Rule 12, and that's consistent with Ms. Sweeney's evidence. I then move on to, I guess, the 4 shorter points there. Paragraphs 15, 16 and 17 refers to my evidence in saying that a conservation strategy is more appropriate than requiring municipal water supply takes to effectively cease upon a minimum flow. I go on to acknowledge that both cessation and conservation strategies are tools in managing effects during low flows, and point out that a plan need not just confine itself to one of those tools. It could actually consider both and apply them in different ways. And given the essential nature of municipal uses, a water conservation strategy may be a more appropriate tool than a flat-out cessation, which I acknowledge would only be the case if a municipal water body did not participate in such a stream maintenance enhancement scheme. But as outlined in Mr. Close's evidence, there may be valid reasons why that isn't appropriate or preferable for a municipal supplier. So the key point there is that a water conservation strategy approach is a valid approach to be considered and provided for within policy, and is certainly the approach that has been adopted in a number of existing resource consents to manage the very issue which has been discussed. The matter around timeframes around the Ngāruaroa River schemes, the point here was that Policy 41 basically directs the Regional Council to consider a storage and release scheme to offset the cumulative stream depletion effect of groundwater takes. Now, Policy 42 refers to effectively reviewing how the groundwater limit is considered. So if there's such a strong connection between the need to consider a storage and release scheme to offset groundwater take effects, then that scheme really needs to be investigated prior to the review in Policy 42. My concern is that there is just no indication in the policy that that will actually occur. It may be that that's the intent and has just been missed out, but I think it is important enough to make sure that that does occur ahead of the review in Policy 42. Turning to paragraph 20 under the title Groundwater Management Review, which is within Policy 42, our submission there is that that should be amended to require the consideration of new information on the long-term sustainable equilibrium of a groundwater resource that accounts for annual variation in climate and prevents seawater intrusion. So as acknowledged in paragraph 1475 of the Section 42A report.
Seems funny when you say that.
It does, yeah. Further investigations need to be undertaken to fully understand the water available. However, none of the items currently listed in Policy 42 consider that very matter. So we're just suggesting that maybe that should be included. The last matter there, transferability of water permits for food processing. Here, Policy 1048 relates to the change or transfer of water permits. The councils generally support the approach of considering the decline of applications when the change or transfer is away from the irrigation of versatile land on the Heretaunga Plains, primary production, especially food production, but is cognizant that water is not only required to grow food, but to also process it. So what we're suggesting there is that food processing be included as an exemption under subsection C of Tank 48 to effectively allow water to be transferred away from the irrigation of versatile land if that is to be transferred to food processing. In my evidence,
So you just suggested that so it goes C1, 2, and you expect 3 to be popped in there, is it?
yes. And in my evidence, I just provide commentary there that would actually be better aligned with district plans and gives effect to the RPS, because both district plans do acknowledge, I guess, the very close relationship of food production and food processing as part of that total chain. So that was an attempt to summarise the highlights of my evidence, and happy to take questions.
A couple from me. First of all, why does Policy 37 prevent consideration of Section 1042A?
I think it's in the actual and reasonable use side of things. So I guess my thoughts there are, because I try to obviously identify an example, you may have a industrial activity who has established in the Hawke's Bay region perhaps only a few years ago. They have done all the right thing. They have invested in their water permit and had that granted for 10 years. They have invested in some infrastructure to commence their activity, but they may not have actually got to the point where they're optimising their infrastructure, or they may be doing that in a staged manner. So effectively, they may not have exercised the full extent of their permit. Now, 2 years later, Plan Change 9 comes along and says, right, when we reallocate water to you, we're only going to base it on net use prior to May 2020. Now, Section 104 Section 104.2a would direct a consent officer at the time to consider the value of investment that that industry put in. And I think that's where the policy fails to allow the consent officer to consider that.
If I'm making a decision on a resource consent, then I have to go through the Section 104 criteria, all right? What's the words? I have to have regard to the Section 104 criteria.
Yep.
So actual and potential effects, etc., etc. 104.2a is one of those matters, or whatever the clause is, that's listed in Section 104. As a decision maker, I have to have regard to existing investment. I don't see how Policy 37 prevents me doing that. I've got a statutory obligation to do it as a decision maker.
So my view is that the two pull in different directions, and I'm suggesting that the policy would benefit from providing, I guess, greater guidance or a surety to a processing officer that they may, with, I guess, potentially more confidence, consider that Section 104.2a matter without feeling as though they're directed by policy not to.
I just can't accept the argument, given that it's a statutory consideration. So you and I have a different view on it.
Yeah. I see it as a risk area that could be fixed.
My other question relates to your evidence in chief and what you're recommending at paragraph 27.
27, was it, sorry?
27 of your evidence in chief.
As regards policy 37.
Policies, a proposed policy 37A. Now, lots of people have disliked the prohibited activity status of Rule 12, so you're far from the only ones in that regard, and certainly it's a matter of active consideration for the panel. But just in terms of what you've got here, it's full of words like not or not likely, significant, not otherwise addressed, and then you say in paragraph 34 you would expect cumulative effects to be carefully assessed. Shouldn't cumulative effects, amongst other things, be listed in that particular policy, or any policy that's regarding a non-complying, if there's to be a non-complying activity status, cumulative effects should be part of that policy framework.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay.
Yep.
I just had a question just regards, this is at paragraph 41, and you mentioned it on your summary, just regards those unintended consequences, and I just wondered whether you cast your mind by having those changes as you've recommended, whether you could foresee any unintended consequences the other way.
The other way, yeah. And absolutely. I think in responding to the initial concern and trying to present a solution, I was very careful to, take guidance from what the RPS is actually setting down and from those higher order documents. So I have tried to respond to the direction provided there, and I think that in itself, helps mitigate the risk of cumulative effects on the basis that the outcome would be one which is at least contemplated by the RPS. But there's a few, comments there to, curb things, for want of a better word. And essentially, the points under A, B and C, if you look at the proposed policy 37A, those points are really trying to acknowledge what Plan Change 9 is trying to achieve in terms of setting what I'm obviously referring to as a target. It's acknowledging the limits specified in Schedule 31 and 32. And that's sort of first and foremost. The points 1, 2, 3 and 4 are, they take direction of the RPS and the higher order documents that I referred to. And then finally I've stated there that the volume of take and consent duration may be distinguishing factors. So the point there is that you may get an activity which has considered alternatives and there really isn't any. It may be that the volume of take is quite minor and that it is consistent with the RPS direction in 1, 2, 3 and 4, and it may be that it's only for a limited time. So I guess through the criteria that we're trying to establish, that in itself is intended to avoid ongoing cumulative effects or, a broad spectrum of activities that could fall under the policy.
Yeah, because we've certainly heard from a number of submitters, and I wouldn't want to cast submitters into particular sides of a fence, and you could have those who are quite conservative and very focused on environmental conservation, and those submitters who are resource users who want to have a sustainable business and grow and want to use other businesses. And there are those who I'd class are a bit in the middle. They're both doing some conservation work and they're looking at growing their businesses as well. So I was trying to think about the different scenarios that we've heard over the last 2.5 weeks, and where we've had a number of users. I think there's been a consistent theme. They either want more water or we should use less water.
And I think
what might be some unintended consequences of having a window, be it a short or small window, everyone will be trying to fit through that window. And just words like distinguishing factors, that's quite a broad term.
It is, and I think I make a comment in my evidence that, that wording can certainly be developed over, as part of caucusing and so on. But I think it's the principles behind it, I think, are valid in terms of responding to the planning documents that we're taking guidance from, and the, I guess, the concern of no options. And in some respects, I kind of find, we were talking earlier about the challenge or the tension about reconciling conflicting policy directions. And I guess in my view, this could be looked upon as a tool that does actually do that.
I could certainly see by the drafting of that's
the intention. Yeah.
But often it's the devil is in the detail.
Yeah. And also, but I would make the comment that, the consideration of the policy is implemented through a resource consent process, which is a process in itself. And there's, a wealth of guidance and scrutiny around that. And the point of a plan is to, provide guidance for that process. Those outcomes don't need to be preempted.
I suppose certainty is another factor as well. Okay. Thank you. I'll just see if we've got any other questions or supplementary questions. I'm just going to have a quick check to see if my questions have all been answered. We don't have any further questions for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That's the case for the district councils. Can I just check there was no further documentation or information that you wanted us to provide after the hearing? I didn't have
I'll
any
just
notes
double
of
check.
anything.
We did
but-
have that request for a conversation with council
Yes.
officers when they're available. There was a couple of questions there.
And what efficiency means, please.
Mm.
So I think I've also got a note here about if we can, determining how much of those ANZIC classes that are wet industry are on municipal versus water supplies.
Yes,
You
it's
still after
that
that?
percentage, yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was all we had.
Okay. Thank you very much
Hey, thank
for
you very much
all of
for
your
coming
time. Thank you.
We are now on our break. We are scheduled to come back at 2 o'clock, but we'll just have a look to see, is that okay in terms of 2 p.m? Fantastic, thank you. And by then we will probably have an announcement from the capital about what's happening down there, so we can just let everybody know. That may or may not change travel plans for this week.